So the next big category that we have is religion. Um, and especially this move towards fundamentalism as well. It's going to be a pretty big deal, not only within obviously the one that we see the most, or at least in the Western world, the one that we see the most, the Islamic fundamentalists, but also there's going to be other types of fundamentalism, including Christian fundamentalism, Hinduism, Buddhism. I mean, you name it. All of the religions are going to have some element of fundamentalism going on.
So, modernity is going to present a challenge to the world's religion. This process of becoming modern is in a lot of ways very, very secular. It's very, very new, and religions are very traditional and old school inspired. So that in and of itself is going to cause some unsettledness amongst the world's religions. And this isn't necessarily anything new. I mean, we have advanced thinkers of the 18th to the 19th centuries believing that supernatural religion was headed towards extinction. We have a sharp decline in religious beliefs and practices in some places. I mean, religion is becoming much more of a cultural phenomenon rather than, something that has any type of larger significance. The spread of scientific culture is also going to convince some small minorities that the only realities worth considering were those that can be measured scientifically. Um, and really, we start to see this pretty early on. In fact, you want to put down here next to number three, you want to put down that this is an outgrowth. This is an outgrowth of the scientific revolution. This is an outgrowth of the scientific revolution. And in a lot of ways, it's almost as though with these people that science becomes a religion. However, the most prominent trends of the last century have been the further spread of the major world religions, their resurgence in new forms, and their attacks on elements of secular and global modernity. Like, for example, Buddhist ideas and practices are going to be well received in the West. I mean, Buddhism is going to spread from something that is kind of strictly East Asian to something that is very attractive, or some elements are very attractive to it in the West. Christianity is going to spread even further, with a majority of Christians no longer in Europe or in the United States. Islam is also going to spread widely, especially, and you want to put down here next to C, especially in Southeast Asia, especially in Southeast Asia. The other element here is that religious pluralism, where people are practicing different aspects of many religions, is on a level that has never before been seen. So, the most vocal element of religion during this era is going to be fundamentalism. And just the basics here is that fundamentalism is a major reaction against modernization and globalization. And there's a couple different elements to it: militant piety, defensive, exclusive. Um, the important thing here is that it has developed in every major religious tradition, even though obviously the most visual or the most visible one is going to be Islamic militantism and fundamentalism. That's not going to be the only expression of fundamentalism here. And the reason why we kind of have this burst of fundamentalism is that many features of the modern world appear threatening to established religions. We have upset the customary class, family, and gender relationships. Nation states, which previously had often been associated with a particular religion, are undermined by a global economy and by foreign culture. So, for a lot of people, there's the feeling of a loss of identity, and their loss of religion is going to be coupled with that loss of identity. So fundamentalists have responded with the selective rejection of modernity. The term fundamentalism, and actually, you want to start off by putting a star here next to number four, please. The term fundamentalism comes from the US religious conservatives in the early 20th century who called for a return to the fundamentals of Christianity. Many saw the US as on the verge of being a moral abyss, and they believed that if by going back to the fundamentals of Christianity, it would recover the United States from that, potential drop into the moral abyss. So fundamentalism, regardless of the religion, is going back to the fundamentals of that religion, whether it be the fundamentals of Christianity, whether it be the fundamentals of Islam, of Buddhism, of Judaism, of Hinduism. It doesn't matter. It's going back to what is the most basic, or at least the perceived basic message of insert religion here. Now, the first of the fundamentalists that we're going to deal with is the Islamic fundamentalism. And again, like I've said a couple of times, Islamic fundamentalism is the most prominent fundamentalism of the 20th century. Um, and this has a legacy. This didn't just come out of, the clear blue sky. There's a reason for this gravitation to fundamentalism, and a lot of it is wrapped up in the great disappointments in the Muslim world by the 1970s. Now, some of this is a consequence of the decolonization that occurred in the 1940s and 1950s, and these areas are still reeling from that. There's also some global economic problems that hit the Middle East very, very hard, to the point where you have a lot of young Muslim men who are very well educated, not being able to find a job, having this sense of this loss of identity, gravitating towards this more fundamental Islam, or the message of a more fundamental Islam, to create some type of stability in their life, to create some type of an identity. So with this, ultimately, with this renewal, we're going to see some new states, Egypt, Iran, Algeria, pursue basically Western and secular policies, but these policies are going to be largely unsuccessful. And foreign intrusion, again, this is kind of a fallout of imperialism, is going to continue. Well, the problem is that none of these problems are solved by Western interference. So, because of this, there's a growing attraction of an Islamic alternative to Western models. You want to go ahead and put a star by that, number three as well. That there's this new way of doing things, this secular way, this Western way of doing things isn't cutting it straight. So maybe we need to go back to something that's a little bit more us. And for the Middle East, that little bit more us, of course, is going to be Islam. There's also going to be a reaction against a lot of Western foreign policy, especially the United States support for the creation and continued support for the newly created nation of Israel. That's going to have a massive, massive backlash in the region as well. So, what we ultimately have here is penetration of fundamentalist thought in the Islamic world by the 1970s. And this is going to include a bunch of things here. In fact, you want to put a star here by this section A through E. We'll kind of go over a couple of these. And there will be a note that will also go next to D, but it's not a very big note. One, as with all fundamentalism, there's going to be an increase in religious observance. Many women are going to voluntarily adopt a modest dress and veils. Again, they're going back to some of the fundamental preachings and teachings of Islam. Many governments are going to use Islamic rhetoric and practices as an anchor. Again, this is a way for them to step away from the Western world and from Western intrusion and from Western ideals. There's also going to be a series of Islamic organizations formed to provide social services. This is going to be a way for um, a lot of the gaps to be filled. This is also going to be a way for the fundamentalist message to get spread to more people, because these benevolent organizations, these social services, are going to step into the void and fulfill the basic needs of the people that aren't or can't be met by these secular Western inspired elements of these Middle Eastern governments. You also eventually are going to have Islamic activists becoming leaders in unions and professional organizations as well. So these fundamentalists are going to become more and more visible as time goes on. So they're not these, seen to be like these religious recluses or these religious kooks. They're kind of, more in the everyday type of visual. And in fact, here, you want to go back to D and you want to put down, and I said this, but I forgot to have you write down. You want to put, please, here that these were meant to fill the gaps left by failing governments. These were meant to fill the gaps left by failing governments. And of course, these failing governments would have been secular. They're also going to be Western inspired and also Western influenced as well. Some groups are also going to seek to overthrow compromised regimes. Like, for example, we have the Islamic takeover of Iran in 1979, which we mentioned last chapter, Afghanistan in 1996, also some parts of northern Nigeria in 2000. All are going to implement radical Islamization. And one of the things that it's important to mention is you want to put somewhere down in the section here underneath number 6, do you want to put, please, here that these radical Muslims are attacking anything, quote unquote, Western. These radical Muslims are attacking anything, quote unquote, Western. Like other examples are going to be in Pakistan and Sudan, the military governments are going to introduce some elements of Sharia law. We're even going to have such a violent reaction against any type of thing that can be perceived as Western that you actually have Egyptian Islamic jihadists assassinating Anwar Sadat in 1981. Anwar Sadat, by the way, was the president of Egypt, and the jihadist really believes that Sadat was amazingly influenced by the West, and in order to prevent that continued influence, Sadat had to be removed. He had to be assassinated. There's also obviously attacks on hostile foreign powers. We have Hamas in Palestine, Hezbollah in Lebanon. All are going to target Israel because, again, that definitely is a symbol of Western intrusion into the Middle East. There's also the response to Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. And there's also going to be violent struggles also within the Islamic world as well, where the fundamentalists, and this is going to be common with all fundamentalists, they will interpret the Quran in a highly literal and dogmatic way. Again, you want to put down here next to A, underneath number 8, that this is iconic of all fundamentalists. This is iconic of all fundamentalists. Christian fundamentalists are going to interpret the Bible in a highly literal and dogmatic way. Fundamental Buddhists are going to interpret the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama in highly literal and dogmatic ways. The Jewish fundamentalists are going to interpret the Torah in highly literal and dogmatic ways. I mean, it is what links, or one of the many things that link fundamentalism, regardless of the religion, together. They'll also go and they will define those that disagree with them as non Muslims. Like, even if you are also Muslim, if you do not believe in the same fundamentalist principles as the fundamentalists do, then they just simply chalk you in as non Muslims. They will also be drawn into violent jihad as a legitimate part of Islamic life as well. The catch with all of this, and even though fundamentalism, of course, gets the most amount of airplay because it is spectacular, militancy isn't the only religious response to modernity. In fact, guys, that's going to be important for us to note. So you want to go ahead and put a star by that. There is, within Islam, there is considerable debate within the Islamic world. Many have acted peacefully within established political structures. Fundamentalism isn't necessarily the norm. Some Muslim intellectuals have called for a dialogue between civilizations, like let's sort this out, let's get out some of the bad air, some of the misunderstanding, some of the misinterpretations. And others have argued that traditions can change in the face of modern realities. Some Muslims will argue that, Islam, in the same way some Christians will argue that Christianity and the Bible are living and breathing entities. That, they are not these static documents that, in order to be devout, need to be adhered to strictly. That there's some movement, there's some alteration that can come as times change, as the modern world continues to evolve. There's no reason why we have to continue to maintain what a lot of people see to be these very, very antiquated ways. And other religions, of course, are also going to respond to global modernity. And the catch here is, you want to put this down here next to number three, that the response is not always conservative. The response is not always conservative. And also go and put a star by number three as well, because, this is kind of, a big deal. The response to religion isn't always a backwards looking or a go to fundamentalism. For some religions, they are attempting to adjust their message to adjust to the situation at hand. So it's a very forward looking reform rather than a backwards looking reform in some cases.